we should start. There's still a few people joining us. So I'm Gavin Rees from the Dart-Center for Journalism and Trauma, and I'm going to introduce myself a bit more and my colleagues in a second. But first, maybe Sergey, if you...
Дякую, Гевін. І, шановні колеги, мене звати Сергій Томіленко, я голова Національної спілки журналістів України. І, шановні учасники нашого воркшопу, насамперед представники українських медіа, українські медіаексперти, представники навчальних закладів. Я презентую вже другий воркшоп у співпраці Національної спілки журналістів України із Дарт-центром, або це Центр травми та журналістики, який є проектом Колумбійської школи журналістики. Сьогодні ми проводимо з вами важливу зустріч на тему, як журналістам писати про дітей, котрі зазнали насильства. Особливо ми говоримо про важкий травматичний досвід дітей у часи війни. І я думаю, що Гевін представить шанованих спікерів авторитетних, які поділяться певними порадами, досвідом, і Дарт-центр є лідируючим в світі організацією саме з отаких порад щодо щодо журналістики травми і щодо уваги до ментального здоров'я журналістів. А я хотів би зараз просто зорієнтувати учасників на кількох технічних моментах. Насамперед, у нас сьогоднішня подія, переважно вона буде йти англійською мовою, тому для зручності українським учасникам ми пропонуємо використовувати можливості перекладу, професійний переклад. Оберіть, будь ласка, внизу в зумі українську мову для того, щоб ви могли для себе отримувати інформацію від перекладача, від Аліси, яка нам допомагає професійно, полегшує сприйняття певної професійної лексики. Також звертаємо увагу, що у нас записується наша подія і робляться фото, тому просимо вашої згоди на використання ось цих всіх записів. Ну і також, оскільки ми працюємо на цифровій платформі, то просимо теж коректно слідкувати, ось як зараз, за своїми трансляціями, за мікрофонами тощо, для того, щоб нам всім було спокійно працювати. На фінал я хочу останнє, я залишу в чаті, скористаюсь цими повноваженнями, посилання на резолюцію нашої великої конференції, яку ми проводили минулого тижня, міжнародної, напередодні 3-ї річниці вторгнення, і в рамках цієї великої резолюції, як заклик до міжнародних організацій підтримувати українських журналістів і медіа, ми заакцентували також увагу на важливості турботи про ментальне здоров'я журналістів у часи війни. Я думаю, що це буде теж корисним нам у роботі. Дякую, колеги, за долучення і передаю слово Гевіну.
Great, thank you so much, Sergey. It's a delight for us to be here. We've been working, trying to support Ukrainian journalists since the full-scale invasion and also before. The first time I worked in Ukraine was 2015-16, and so we have a long relationship with Ukraine. I'm just going to quickly share a slide just to thank our sponsors. And I want to put a note out that we're only able to do this event because we've received funding and support from UNESCO and also from the people of Japan who've been supporting UNESCO initiatives in Ukraine to support journalists. And I know they've also been supporting the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine as well. So glad that we're working together on this. This, I'd like to point out to you, is a website that hosts our resources in Ukrainian language. And so if you're working on a variety of things, you may be interviewing victims and survivors of Russian war crimes. There are some very detailed resources. There's also a tip sheet as well by Ірен Казеллі, who's one of our presenters today, on how to work with children. So that's a resource that you can use, and it's available at dartcenter.org.ua. So I'll stop sharing, and so I can see people's faces. Let me introduce our speakers. First of all, we have Dr. Ketrін Porterfілd, who I've been working with in workshops around the world for years now. And she's a clinical psychologist and a specialist in the rehabilitation of torture survivors. She works out of the Bellevue Clinic in New York City. And also she has a particular kind of career interest in working with child refugees and children who are survivors of trauma. So a quick note about us and the Darт-Center, in case you're not aware of exactly what we do. We work as an international alliance. And so our way of working is that we bring together expert journalists and filmmakers who have an interest in improving how we report on trauma, how we cover violence, the most consequential most consequential stories that our societies face. And we tend to bring together trauma experts like clinical psychologists together with journalists and expert reporters. So now let me introduce an expert reporter along with an expert psychologist. And this is Ірен Казеллі, and she heads up the Darт-Center's Early Childhood Development Reporting Initiative, in which every year we bring together journalists across the world who have an interest in improving how we cover children's experience of trauma, tragedy, and violence. I want to make a kind of quick and preliminary observation here. Although all of us care deeply about the situation on the ground in Ukraine, none of us are Ukrainian experts. And you're the experts in your own reporting, in your own stories, in your own challenges. And the idea behind this seminar series, this is the middle seminar of 3 seminars, is to offer kind of comparative data. So what we're offering you are tactics and strategies that journalists have found useful in different situations. And we're doing that because very often having an opportunity to think a little bit outside of one's own circumstances and to see how journalists and other trauma experts have approached the same issues in different places can be a good way of getting new ideas, new inspirations, and new thoughts about how to respond to these very kind of complex, difficult challenges that we're looking at today. Anyway, let me pass the baton on to my 2 colleagues. They're the ones who have real expertise in the issues that we're talking about today. And so I'd like to start with Kate. Oh, one quick thing I should have said. If you want to ask any questions, please don't hesitate to put those into the chat, and we'll also try and create spaces in which we can pick up on your questions as we're going along. And thanks again for taking the time to join us in this really important discussion.
Thank you,
Kate.
Gavin. Good morning. My name is Ketrін Porterfілd. I'm a clinical psychologist. Very honored to be here today with my colleagues, Irena and Gavin, as well as Crystal Grow and Kate Black from the Darт-Center in New York City. I'm going to dive right in because I have some material I really would like to cover. I am a New Yorker, which means I talk fast, and so I'm going to try to slow down for our wonderful interpreter, who I also want to thank this morning. So I'm going to begin with some slides, which will, I hope, begin to provide a foundation for the conversation today about engaging with children affected by war, conflict, human rights violations. So I'm going to begin to share my slides. Gavin, you give me a heads up if there's any problem, but I will be okay. So I would like to start today, first of all, thanking you again, the National Union of Journalists of Ukraine. We're so honored to be with you, and we'll be thinking today with you, Irena and I, as well as Gavin, who, by the way, I'm sure many of you know, is a tremendously experienced expert on covering trauma across the world. But as we share today, I'm going to begin with presenting to you a grounding, a frame, a foundation for understanding what war and conflict do to children, because you really can't understand how to approach a child and think about telling a story unless you actually understand, well, what might be happening to this child in their body, in their mind, and in their relationship to other people. So on the screen, if you're looking in English, you see a word biopsychosocial. If you're looking at Ukrainian translation, I hope it's a clear word. It's a word that I, a psychologist, recommend you use when trying to understand what happens to children and teenagers and adults who face trauma or stress. So I'm going to now teach you a little bit about that before my wonderful colleague Irena brings this to life with some examples. So I do want to make one acknowledgement from us, as Gavin did. We would like to recognize humbly to this audience that you are living in an ongoing condition of stress and trauma in your country. And we want to acknowledge we are not living in that context, and we know that that could affect our understanding. So we say that again with humility. My experience has been for 25 years working with children and families affected by trauma, war, imprisonment, and refugee flight. So I hope there will be parallels. So today I want to begin by thinking about when we ask the question, what do we do when trying to understand a child's experience of aggression and war? What do we do? I'm going to say to you, if you begin with this frame, which is think of the child in front of you as a biopsychosocial human, and we want to recognize that trauma affects all of those parts of that little person. So let's understand what we mean by biopsychosocial. And I promise you, if you pay attention to these tools, you can use them in real life. In other words, these are not just ideas. I use these tools when I'm sitting with a prisoner, when I'm sitting with a child whose family may have fled the Congo or fled a country under conflict. And what I mean by that is I look at that person who may have suffered trauma and I start trying to think, where has trauma affected them? Because I know trauma affects all parts of the human. First of all, so important to know, trauma affects our body, what we're going to call bio. Why? Because your body, that body that you're in right now, is wired, it is ready to do something if you are in trouble, if you are in danger. So the body of a child has had to sometimes adapt in order to survive what the war or conflict may be making the child feel in the body. So we're going to break that down in 1 minute. But first, I want to cover the other two, which is we are not just a body, right? Like these skin and bones. We are also a mind, and our psychological self is wired to make meaning of what happens to us. I'll say that twice. Our mind makes meaning, tells ourselves a story about what happens to us. And with trauma and violence, we often tell ourselves a story that is very linked to danger, violence, harm, things that the trauma made us feel. So children's meaning making, the stories that children tell us, will often have trauma in them in terms of the way the child is making sense of the world. I'll give a quick example. A child who says, "The soldiers came to my home." By the way, I will not use a lot of examples that are upsetting, but I will tell you if I'm going to use an example. So I'm going to use a small example now of soldiers coming to a child's home. That child might say, "The soldiers came, I should have done something. I should have helped my father when they came up to my father. I should have done something." And what you, the journalist, will be hearing in that is that that child is making meaning by starting to blame himself or starting to have guilt or a sense of responsibility. So I'm inviting you to listen today and think about the meaning making that the people of Ukraine are doing in the face of this violence and this conflict, especially what children or teenagers tell you. Finally, we are social beings. That means we need to attach to each other, and war and trauma affect our attachment. They affect our sense of people. Children will start to notice people and be thinking about, are they dangerous? Are they going to hurt me? Are they bad? So you want to be noticing the body reaction, which I'm going to describe right now, the meaning making of that child in front of you, and what are they doing with other people, including you, the journalist. How do they see you? They might not see you in the way you think. You might think I'm a nice, kind journalist, and they might have a reminder as they look at you of something scary or something that they are worried about. So you want to just watch carefully the child's biopsychosocial reaction. I want to spend a few minutes on the biological reaction. So please stick with me. I hope this is coming in clear. But if you understand what the human body does under trauma, you will be very, very good at paying attention to that person in front of you who you know was in a war zone. You will watch them and listen to them differently. A few ideas first. Stress is a word in English that means the normal response to your environment. So stress happens with everyday things. You might have a stress from money, something in your family, health, something at work. Stress, unfortunately, is normal. We do have stress pretty much as humans a lot. Now, trauma is different. In English, the word trauma, I know you use that word too, is something uniquely overwhelming. It takes over the body, and then the body, remember bio, the body has to respond. In other words, trauma is not something that you think through. You don't plan and cope with an immediate trauma. In a minute, by the way, I will talk about chronic trauma of war. I will. So that reaction to trauma is often life or death kind of situation, or, this is important, something that is very threatening to the human safety. So I know in your country there is enormous ongoing stress, but also very serious trauma happening to your people. Witnessing trauma can also give us a reaction in our body. Think about a child who sees something frightening, who hears air raid sirens, who knows that someone has disappeared. This can be the witnessing of trauma. And that, of course, is something that you all are experiencing as well. I would like to acknowledge that. Okay, let me spend a few minutes on what that body does, when we are in a situation of trauma. So if you're on the screen and watching, you see on the screen that survival coping is what the body goes into. We call that survival coping when something is threatening our safety. And if you look on the screen, you should see two arrows. There's a red arrow, and we're going to use that now. We're going to call that red arrow. And red arrow means our body has to go upwards and activate. In English, we say activate because we're in danger. I'll give you an example in a minute. Now, look at the other arrow, though. This is so important, everybody. There's a gray arrow on the screen. The gray arrow also represents something so important and so common to people who are under stress or trauma, which is the body sometimes shuts down. I'll say that again. The body sometimes shuts down. That reaction can be very apparent or obvious when you are talking to someone who has seen or been through trauma. You may see red arrow activation, or you may see gray arrow shutdown, or you may see both. Let's use an example, because for children, it's important to understand these arrows might be happening while you're talking to them, and their brains are developing in the context of war. So sometimes these things become very much In English, the word we would use is habituated. And what that means is kind of it develops into the child's regular coping, is that they are in states of red arrow activation or gray arrow shutdown. Let's use a little simple example. And please understand, on the screen, you see a simple example. This is not a war example, but I want to use this example to just explain the red and gray arrows a minute. This man on the screen, we see he's in trouble, right? Look on your right side of your screen. He is running from a snake that has just come at him as he stepped out of his cottage in the woods. What would a person do if they looked down and saw a big animal coming at them very fast? I imagine you all know that you would probably do what I would do, unless you're very tough and strong. You would probably scream or jump or run away, right? Or maybe if you're really able to, you'd pick up a chair or a broom and start hitting the snake. Now, look at that arrow. All of those things I described are ways you would try to do what? Fight the thing that is the danger or run from the thing that is the danger. In English, we say fight or flight. So fight it or run. So this man, to save himself, is going to need what? That red arrow. He needs his body to make his heartbeat, to make his breathing change, and to get him strong and fast in that moment. So please think about that for a minute. When we're under threat, our nervous system, our body, our brain gives us the chemicals that we need to run or to jump or to fight. But to do that, your body has to change how it's operating. I'll say that again. To fight or to run, your body has to change how it's operating. And so it does. It pumps you with blood and it gets you a lot of oxygen. Think about a child. I know that's hard to do when we're thinking about the children of Ukraine, but I want you to think about a child who has something scary happen. They probably needed their heart to race and their breathing to change in order to get away. Now, after something scary, let's look at our guy again on our screen. On the left side, we see what the body does after trauma, after we get away from a threat. What is he doing? He's lying down, right? Because after something frightening, the gray arrow has to try to come on, right, in the body and slow everything back down. Think about if something scares you and you get away from it, afterwards you often feel tired. You have to hold on to something, lie down, maybe, oh my gosh, drink some water. Why? Because now your body is trying to recover. Now, the red arrow happens when we need to fight or flight. The gray arrow is the other side that brings us down. This is when it's one threat, like one snake, okay? What do we know, though, about people who have suffered frightening things? We know that the memory of what they went through, if you look on your screen, you see that big brain, the memory gets put into our brain, so that memory of the snake, in the state that you were in when you had to run from the snake. So I want you to look at the screen and look at the brain and think of our man with the snake. When he had to run, the memory of running from the snake was going into his brain, right? And as that was happening, he was in that state of the red arrow. So when he remembers the snake, this is important, guess what happens? His heart starts racing. He starts sweating. His breathing changes. When he then finishes talking about the snake, he's tired. He starts yawning. These are the ways a person might present to you, the journalist, when they are telling you something bad. They might start to look red in the face, sweaty, nervous, and they might start to be tired and yawn and look like they are flat. In English, we say flat, like maybe the word numb, like they have no reaction. So I'm hoping this is reminding you all of the many important stories you've told and some of the people you've worked with, because what's important is if you pay attention to this, you will then be able to approach somebody in a careful way. So I'm going to keep going a minute. I know I'm talking a lot. Stick with me. I have a few more things about the trauma reaction, and then about how to approach a child. So we know that what you all are dealing with aggression, conflict, violence against your country, is what we would call ongoing trauma. It is not one snake. I have on the screen trauma plus. Why? Because you look at the many things you all are dealing with that are not just one frightening moment, right? Constant reminders of what is happening, air raids, people having to leave homes, children being separated and taken away, family members disappearing, many, many things. We know that that trauma then is what you call chronic trauma. And what chronic trauma does is it makes people start to be more in the mode, more likely to shut down. Okay, so let's think about this a minute. What does this look like in children? Okay, children, preschoolers, I want to spend a minute on little kids, then I'm going to tell you about middle age and then adolescence. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of a frame for how to approach that child. And then Irena is going to give us examples. Okay, so let's think of our red arrow and our gray arrow and think about a preschool child age, let's say, I'm not really doing infancy, but let's just say, you know, age 2 to 4. Okay, in preschool children affected by war, research shows us we often see anxiety and what we call problems with separation. The child has trouble leaving an adult. They might cry, they might hold on. We see that sometimes children lose skills that they once had when they're in stress. So a child who used to be able to use the toilet now starts having toilet accidents. Children might start to seem a little bit withdrawn or aggressive. Think about the red arrow. If the little person's body has been activated into that red arrow, they might show that by hitting or throwing something or seeming angry. Children can present sometimes with a very flat, numb presentation, which they almost seem like they're not really taking things in. And if you look on the screen, repetitive play means that sometimes children who are in the middle of stress or conflict will show that in their play. They might take toy dolls, you know, and start making the dolls fighting, or they might make bombs drop. I saw that a lot with children I worked with in Kosovo. Also being disorganized in their attachment. All that means is they don't know whether to move towards somebody or away. And sometimes they might seem that they're holding on to adults or pushing away adults. It's like an uneven attachment. School age children. Now we see children, what, ages 5 through maybe 12, they are developing their brain. Biopsychosocial is changing. They can express themselves more. They use words. Now they might be telling you, I'm scared. School-age children who are traumatized often say, I'm afraid it will happen again. I'm sure in your country you are seeing children who are talking about air raids and what it feels like when you hear that sound and what it might mean. Children having flashbacks or being what we call jumpy meaning something makes a noise and they react. Children having trouble concentrating is quite common. Those kids who are in school who cannot stay in their seat, maybe they don't listen as well. Maybe they are just having trouble focusing. Unfortunately, that is normal if that child is under a traumatic condition. Sleep trouble is also something you might see in school age, as well as back to aggression. Somatic complaints just means stomach aches, headaches, things like that. A minute on adolescents, who are our beautiful young people growing up into adulthood. What do we know is happening for teenagers? Meaning making, right? Biopsychosocial. Adolescents are growing into people who are making meaning about the world. They can think abstractly, and they might be thinking, why is this like this? How did this happen? How did the adults let this happen? Adolescents can develop a lot of anger or worry about their parents. They can feel self-blaming. Remember my example. They can also just feel sad and powerless. So adolescents might show their response by withdrawing and not having words, or by being very angry or very focused on, we have to change this, we have to make change. Not all reactions are negative. I do want to say that. Not all children's reactions are negative. Please remember that. Okay, I want to spend a few minutes before I hand to Irena talking about how to talk to this child in front of you who we've just been learning may have red arrow times of activation where they feel edgy, scared, heart racing as they remember something, or they might seem shut down, flat, numb. And I want to tell you that as you approach that child, I want you to think of yourself like a surgeon. A surgeon is very careful when they begin surgery. They don't just start surgery the first minute they walk into a hospital, right? They get ready. They think about if they're going to operate on the knee, where is that knee in trouble? You know, what part is broken? They think, is this patient someone who's strong and young, or are they maybe a child and I have to be extra careful, or an older person? They notice that the person in front of them might have risk. And so I want to say to you that when you have a frame in your mind for that child, how old are they? What have they been through? It will help you be more organized in your approach, and it will help you watch that child carefully so you can decide, should I be doing this? Should I be asking this question if this child is starting to shake? If this child is looking withdrawn, perhaps I need to change and move away from what I'm doing. So I'm going to share with you 4 points of a way to think about working with children. And there are ways to try to organize your interview or your filming or photographing. The first is you are always asking yourself the question, is this child safe to talk to me? Am I making them feel safe that they can say no, they can not answer a question, they can just say, I don't want to do this? Are they safe? Are they in an environment where there is a support around them so that if I do ask a question, there is some support or some resource for them? So safety is something you're always thinking of as holding up your interview. The second part, though, that is just as important is, are you giving the child control? So when I work with children who have come out of war zones, I spend a lot of time, let's say I'm going to ask them about what happened to them in their country. I'm going to use a not real example. The child may have just come from another country. Maybe they have someone who was imprisoned in their family. So when I meet with them, I might say, I want to learn about you, and I really just want you to tell me what you think is important for me to learn. You are the boss right now. You get to help me learn. Because you know what? You know a lot about your country and what happened. So I would like you to tell me what you think is important. You're trying to give the child a sense of control, including if you are going to ask something, you might say, and I've done this with children, you know, I would like to ask about when they took your dad. But I think that could be a hard thing for a kid to talk about. Some kids don't want to talk about bad things. So do you want to tell me a little bit about that so I can learn, or should we not? You're trying to make sure you're giving the child control the entire time. And if you notice in that example, I'm going to say it again, you also can use something called displacement. In English, it's displacement. I don't know what the word might be, but it means taking the focus off the child and making it on another child. Here's the example. Instead of saying to a child, I would like to know what happened when the bomb fell, you can say, some kids have told me that when bombs come, they feel different things. What do you think of that? And what you're doing is you're saying some kids talk about bombs. Some kids talk about war to me this way. And what you do is you take the focus a little bit off that child. I hope this is translating. During the Q&A, if that was a confusing technique, I'll explain it. but it's a way to give a child control by letting them talk about the idea in another child or more broadly. Okay, 2 more tools, and then I'm going to hand us to Irena. One is that when we're giving safety, we're making sure they have control, and you reflect back what you hear. Please listen to this word in English, reflect back. All that means is that when you're talking to a person who has suffered violence or something frightening or something out of control, you make sure you give them control by saying, I hear what you're saying, and I'd like to say it back to you. So I'm going to give an example. A child says, a teenager says, I hate the war. I hate everybody in this country now. I hate all people. Now, that's a hard thing to hear, right? So you might want to say, well, why? You can't hate everybody, right? You love somebody, right? You want to get your interview to be better. What I would recommend when you hear a child who's been through war say something is to just say it back to them. You're telling me you hate everybody. You're telling me you feel hate sometimes. You just let the child say the thing they're saying and you say it back to them. I hope this makes sense. What it does is it allows the person to feel that you are hearing them, and it often allows a person to say more. So I want to invite you to practice reflecting back with adults too, by the way. It works with adults too, instead of always just moving to the next question. The final piece is closure, which is really just when you finish an interview with a child, you give some time at the end. Irena will talk about this, but you try to talk about something else. Tell me your favorite. Well, actually, I'm going to let Irena, she has a really good example on this, so I'm going to hold on that. You find a way to say, we're going to be finished talking. And what I strongly recommend is you say to the child, you really helped me learn today. You taught me, and I'm a journalist, and I have to learn these things so we can tell the world what's happening. What you do when you do that, what you do in that method I just said, is you take the child's words, they feel heard by you, and then you say, I will take your words and I will reflect them out to the world. It is giving the child something in English we would call mastery, meaning they get to master something hard, as well as a sense that you are, that they helped the world. So safety, control, reflect back, and use closure to make sure that child hears what you're doing and is going on to the next thing safely. Okay, I would like to stop there because I know that Irena is waiting and has excellent examples from her work. Just to finish, remember, the body, the meaning making, and the interpersonal life of a child is affected by war. And so when you sit with a child, think about each part. How is their body showing a reaction? What story are they telling as they make meaning? And what is their reaction to me? Am I making them somehow nervous or scared? What am I doing that might be making that child feel safe or not safe? And then as you think about that red arrow that could be coming up for the child, or that gray arrow that could be making the child feel more detached or shut down, and you notice that in the child, and then you adjust according to what you see. Okay, I know that was a lot. I'm going to stop us. I hope we're all still there. I see a lot of people still there. I'm so happy that this group of amazing journalists is here with us. Irena, I'm passing to you to share with us your perspective.
Can I just jump in very quickly before you do that? So obviously you don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from Irena. She has decades of experience of working with international news organizations in Latin America. So she can take us to the kind of practical implication of that. I just wanted to kind of reflect back that when we're thinking about the impact of stress in an environment in which there's a lot of stress around, and a lot of people have been impacted by the war, there's a tendency sometimes to think that that's just normal. That's just the way things are. And to forget that actually we need to pay a particular kind of attention. And really what we're interested in doing when we're working with people who've been impacted by trauma is noticing the tiny little changes, the particular things that are key to every single individual. So thinking about what's kind of relevant in any situation. But what I wanted to say is that we've got one question so far in the chat, and that's a very interesting question, which is, how do I protect a child from hate that might appear after the story has been published in the media? So we're going to pick up on that later, but I'd really like to encourage you, if you've got a second, maybe some particular concrete practical dilemma, that you put that in the chat, and then that will speed up as we get more and more focused on the issues that are rising in your work. So Irina, please take us to another place and your work.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, everyone, for making time to be here in what is, of course, a very, very challenging circumstance to think about children, which is something that I've been thinking about for a long time and that I think is incredibly important. Let me just share my screen and make sure that I'm sharing it correctly. I am Ірен Казеллі, and I'm a journalist. I have a newsletter that focuses on children, and I lead the early childhood journalism initiative at the Dart-centru. You see this image of me. This is an image that a child drew, particularly my son. But I like to start my presentations with this image because it's a reminder for me that children have a very clear perspective on the world, even though we may think that they are just sort of somewhere in the background and they don't, they're not sort of creating opinion, or there's no sort of obvious impact of the things around us on them, but they have a very clear perspective on the world and things around them. And in my work, I really try to take into account that perspective. You know, children are sort of a fourth of the world's population, and I think it's very important that we take them into account. As we were starting this webinar, we were actually talking with the interpreter, with Elisa, about how difficult it is for you frontline reporters to be even thinking about children, as a great majority of children have fled Ukraine. But I think it is amazing that you are here to talk about children, and that you heard Kate's amazing sort of introduction that has really changed my way of thinking about how to deal with children. But I think it's very important that you're here, because thinking about children is important to understand how we ourselves also approach the work we do, and what the implications for a country in the future are when a large part of the population of children has had to flee, or has family members that obviously are deeply involved in the conflict in one way or another. And even if children are maybe not present so much in the front lines, they will still be very affected by the aggression into Ukraine. So I just want to say that I use this image just to remind us that children have a very clear perspective, and even if we cannot hear them speak, or they're not as sort of rational as we are in certain ways, they are there and they're absorbing a lot of what is happening around them. I see there are some messages coming in, and I don't know if there are questions. Yes, but maybe you'll deal with them, Gavin, because I also cannot immediately translate, but we'll come back to you. So just so that you know, we will come back to you. So the next image I'll show you is an image of a prison in Mexico. This is in Juarez. This is not in Juarez. This is in Chihuahua, in the northern state of Chihuahua, on the border with the US. I worked for a long time in Latin America, and prisons in Mexico allow mothers to be with their babies with them until they're 3 or 4 years old. And I spent some time in this women's prison to try to understand what was happening to these babies, what was, how the sort of difficult circumstances of being in a in a very basic prison where there was a lot of violence, a lot of drugs, how it was affecting them. You'll see a couple of pictures here. What's interesting is that, you know, differently from, you know, other places in the world, like in the UK, in the US, in Australia, where babies are allowed to be with their mothers, but they're in separate sort of units, in separate housing. In these prisons in Mexico, children were just in a normal cell with their mother and cellmates, and there isn't any extra sort of facility for them. You know, there are no playgrounds, there are no cots, there's no special beds for them, there are no special food for them. There was a lot of controversy around whether these babies would do better or worse by being with their mom. There was a lot of evidence that the mothers were doing better by having these babies with them. There were mothers that after they left the prison, they had lower reincidence after when they had been allowed to be with their babies. It kind of helped them motivate themselves and feel sort of a clear reason to get better and to do something and not to go back to prison. But actually, even the prison psychologist was very much wondering, like, is this a good environment for a baby who really has no responsibility to be in this very tough environment? Why am I giving you all this information, which may sound completely remote from your experience, is because I would love to talk about what do you do if you are sort of approaching children that are pre-verbal. So they may be babies, they may be 1 or 2, they may be even be 3, you know, children that have not really been able, that are not yet able to fully communicate in words with you. Of course, you know, we reporters are usually out there for a good quote. Sometimes we're there for some beautiful pictures. Children are usually great for pictures. But, you know, how do we make sure that we can represent them and understand the context when we cannot sort of talk to them? And I'm talking about this prison because to me, it was a really learning experience of how you could just be around. I spent several days in this prison and really just observe the children. A great way to tell stories about children is by observing them and trying to figure out, you know, from their height, like sort of squatting down, what's happening? What are they looking at? What are they playing with? What are, you know, you can, if you cannot observe them for a long time, you can ask their caregivers, you know, are they sleeping? Are they eating? You know, the signs that Kate had up before, you know, how can you tell when a child is in stress? You know, what are the signs of stress in a child so little? So you will find that, you know, if they've regressed and all of a sudden they're having toilet accidents every night, there's something, you know, that you can observe or that you can ask about. If you observe the caregivers, this is also something very important. How are they reacting to the baby's stress? How are they interacting with the child? Do they have space to look at the child? Are they so stressed and overwhelmed themselves that they have no space to hold for a child that may also be in a lot of trouble? And this final point I have here about the digital footprint is something, you know, let me go back to the previous picture if I can, because I'm now somehow, there you go, no, there you go. I still wonder whether it was right to have these pictures up there. You know, the editors at the time really bought this piece because we had access and we could have pictures. And, you know, we had, I'll get back to the idea of consent in a second. We talked to these women. They were very happy to have us there, to talk to us. They were feeling heard. They were very happy for us to be around and take these pictures. But I wonder, you know, what's happening to this child now, all these years later, if they're online and somehow they come across this picture? And what if this picture is also connected to a name or the name of the mother? What if this can be searched? What if their name can be associated somehow with a very dramatic circumstance that is completely out of their control? And when in the future someone is looking them up, this is the picture that comes up of them. So this goes back a bit to that question that Gavin was referring to, which was the first question about, how do you deal with hate? I was just thinking about this. I really would recommend that you think hard about the digital footprint of the pictures you take and names and details that you share about the children that you're reporting about. This is true. This is something that I would recommend for the adults sort of out there as well. But with children, it's even harder. You don't know where these pictures are going to end up, how long they'll be up there for. And these children don't really have a choice. If an adult is saying yes, without understanding fully the potential impact they might have, then you maybe have to be the devil's advocate against yourself and against your own sort of potential work. Because in the end, yes, you want to get out a good story. Yes, you want to illustrate it, but there are a lot of ways to illustrate a story without showing a child's face. So this comes from something that I think was a mistake of, publishing these pictures of these children, where the children are so obviously recognizable. But I'd love to hear also your thoughts about this. Now, this is another story also up in the north of Mexico. And the man in the middle became a pastor, Pastor Núñez. He was an orphan himself, had a very dramatic story, full of violence. And eventually he found religion, found a new meaning for life, and set up an orphanage in his own house of children that had become orphaned because of the violence in Ciudad Juárez. So this is a time when Ciudad Juárez on the north of Mexico was considered the most dangerous city in the world, whatever that means. It had the highest sort of homicides rates in the world. And so at some point there were it was estimated that up to 35,000 orphans were in the city just for having lost their parents to violence. And so he had this sort of home orphanage situation. And, you see all sorts of ages, from the babies to the 20-year-olds that were there. And obviously this was a very unique kind of orphanage, because it was basically a home where this pastor considered all of these children his own children. It wasn't a structure like the ones that you may know from Ukraine, the institutions where children are held. Yet, even with that, one of the things that I think is very important is to really think, wow, this is a lot of children for very little, like very few adults. I mean, yes, you have some older sort of teenagers, but really you're seeing one adult for 20 plus children. No, I'm counting, but yes, it was, there was this ratio. And this is a ratio that really is probably quite real in a lot of institutions. And so I'm bringing this picture to you to have a think about what it means to report on orphans and institutions. Obviously, there's been a lot that has been studied around orphans and institutions. One of the sort of most foundational studies, but Kate obviously is the expert. I'm the non-scientist here, so I'm just gonna tell you what I took from this study, which was a study on orphanages in Romania. and how neglect really affected their brain development. By neglect, we mean really the lack of stimulation and love and care that these children received, because they were many, many children for very few caregivers. Now, we know that institutions really affect children badly in general, because children cannot receive the necessary care that they would receive within a family structure. And this is often due because of a lack of resources. And we see this over and over again. Now, of course, there's a whole special case when we're talking about children that have been held in Russian orphanages, obviously where abuse is rampant. That's a whole other level. I'm now talking about orphans and institutions, sort of an average institution. Now, I would like to bring your attention to the fact that if I was saying before that it's very important that you observe children and the relationship with the caregiver on any kind of day with any child you're dealing with, when you're in an institution, you need to be extra careful, because these children may not have actually a caregiver that they can go back to for support or to cry or to find solace with. So even the most innocent questions you may have, if you're reporting on, on their daily life or how they're dealing with air raids, maybe, things around, you're observing them and you're like, hey, what's your favorite toy? Or how do you feel about your dad being away? Questions that maybe may seem innocent to you because you actually really care. They may have such a weight for these children, and they may not be able to cope because they actually don't have anyone around that they can rely on from an emotional perspective. So when it comes to children whose parents are not around or have died, you need to be extremely careful, because they may just not have the person that can help them with buffering any kind of extra stressful sort of circumstance. And just another sort of caveat, I am in general quite against interviewing children, even though I report on children, because I feel that unless you have time or a deeper rapport, it's very hard to be able to talk to them without sort of creating harm, or without and it's very hard to get what you need out of a child unless you have that relationship. So it's not that great for journalism, and it's not that great for them. And sometimes a lot of the information you get from looking at them and from asking people around. Let me move on. I don't know if there are questions. Gavin, will you tell me if there's anything that I need to stop for? I see you raising your hand.
Sorry, I'm slow to unmute. Yes, I think this is interesting, because also there's an age thing as well, isn't there? There's this whole question, there's a conflict in us, and a conflict in the situation is that on one level, particularly with older children, if we don't give them the space to speak and the space to be heard, then there's a danger that their perspectives disappear, and that we become we're no longer looking at them as kind of real people. Obviously, they're not adults, but they are kind of full people. So I wondered maybe if you could add a little bit more on how we think about consent. So how would you establish the sense that this actually is something that this particular kid really wants to say, and ensure that they want to say it?
Yeah, that's such an important question. Let me actually sort of move on to maybe this. So this is kind of what I was saying, I think as much as you can, get information from others, check for signs of stress, think whether you have enough time and an interview is really necessary. And then if you kind of check these basics and you really think I would love to hear from this person, and you know they are older, you think that you can have that report, because I think, Gavin, it's incredibly important actually what you're saying, that we need to give them a voice, especially older children, that especially in circumstances of, you know, whether they've had to flee a very traumatic circumstance, whether they've experienced violence, whether they've become maybe the main sort of caregivers of younger children. Sometimes these children, these 15-year-olds, these 12-year-olds, they're actually very much, they're very mature. They play an adult role in their circumstance. And so, you know, how do you make sure that you're not patronizing them without sort of taking into account that they are probably extra fragile, because their whole nervous system is still, you know, their brain is still forming, and they are extra sensitive to certain things. So I think once you have all these things clear, I think the important things is really checking in what, you know, going back to what Kate was talking about. If you have a frame and you're clear about what do you want to address, how do you think you can address it, then you can have these techniques, and Kate can come back to this, where your questions, you are asking these questions, but you're asking them in a way that you're giving them enough sort of control over them, that they're not feeling that, hey, yeah, this is yet another adult sort of making decisions for me. Kate, I'd love to have you address this also.
Do you want me to do that now real quick, Irena?
Why not? Yes, I think it would be.
Because I first of all, it's so great what you're talking about. And I also think it relates, though, to the question in the chat that we have about communicating with a child who maybe has already had a negative experience with some adult, journalist, caregiver. Because I think that really leads to the question of your pre-interview behavior with the child, right? Because think of the surgeon. The surgeon doesn't just take their scalpel and go into a knee. The surgeon first makes sure they are sterile, the patient is safe. They do a lot before. With the child, what I would be thinking about is, what has this child's experience been, right? Before I started asking them something. And you can say to the child, not a little child, but, you know, I think, you know, a 10-year-old and up, you can say to them, I want to explain who I am. I am a journalist. I work for this organization. I'm not here to cause you stress. I'm here to learn. But if you don't want to talk about this stuff with me, a grown-up, I understand. What do you think about that? In other words, put a lot in the beginning on explaining to the child who you are, and that you do not have to ask them questions if they don't want to, and that they are in control. And so this child in the example, in the question, is, you know, maybe a child who's had a bad experience. So you might just say, if you don't want to talk to me because you've talked to other grown-ups, that's fine. If you want to learn about me as a journalist, I'll tell you what I do. I'll show you on my phone. Here's where I record you. Here's where I put notes here. Do you see these notes? You become, in English, transparent. And you show the child, I am a journalist. I want to learn from you. But you do not force, obviously, questions without saying, would you want to share with me? So I don't know if that's helpful in consent, Irena, but to me, that first, that question around what if they've had a bad experience, it's very possible they have. So I think you should start from a place of transparently letting the child know who you are and what you're doing. Okay, sorry.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, if you have the possibility to be somewhere where the child is comfortable and where they hang out, and you get a chance to experience what they do instead of you kind of putting them where you want them to be, or kind of making them fit in your idea of what children in that circumstance should or are doing, I think that also really helps you. I actually had this picture that I wanted to show you, which so this was again in Juarez. I have a lot of Mexican examples today, but this was in Juarez, and these were children that had taken over an area that had been abandoned because of gun violence and drugs, and so most people had abandoned their homes and left. And some children from the neighborhood who were still there, they took over some of these abandoned houses and started graffitiing them, and they created their own kind of, you know, I want to say library, but anyways, it's where they went, and you can't see the full space, but they had this like broken sofa where they would hang out. And I was doing this piece on how violence was affecting children in Juarez, and I found the space. This is where they were hanging out. And so I went and took to them there. In the end, this became a story about how they were recovering these spaces and making them their own. But it was a great way to be able to just be like, hey, you know, I am really interested. I'm not just the other reporter who's saying like you're drug addicts or you're violent or you don't care anything about this and that. I actually really think this is cool. Show me how you do it, where you hang out, what you do when you're here. And so, you know, he was showing me the magazines he'd picked up from some of the abandoned houses. And so I think it's very important to really show that you're there with the right intentions, and that even if maybe, you know, you cannot put them at ease because the context doesn't help you, but your attitude is different from the one of a reporter who's just out there with a mic in a child's face just to get that one quote or that one image of, you know, tears, suffering. And, you know, this is another thing that I would love to have you sort of reflect on, because this is something that has really helped me think about things differently, is, you know, try to stay away, if you can, from deterministic ideas. You know, all the things that Kate told you and all the brain science we have does show that trauma and sort of continued stress and, you know, living in a war situation or fleeing war can really affect a child's brain. But that doesn't mean that that's a sentence for life. You know, children are actually, we talk about resilience, but children are very resourceful. We are all very resourceful. Journalists are very resourceful, you know, and as human beings, if we went through something that was very traumatic, it doesn't mean that we're going to be ruined for life, or that there are lost generations of children that will never be able to recover from certain trauma. Of course, it's very hard to report on this because obviously the circumstances are so hard to kind of get away from. But what I'm trying to say is I want to encourage you to think about that child as an individual with their own story, instead of like a part of a puzzle and of a wider narrative that we believe is the only reality. So really making space to be curious and to ask them, hey, what do you like? You know, are you interested in this TV show? Maybe they like chess, maybe they like basketball. You have no idea, you know, and each of us is different, and the same is for children. There's more things around consent, but let's have maybe a break, because I know there's a lot of questions, and my slides are not as important as the questions.
Thank you, Irina. That's fantastic. And also, some of the points I could see that on your next slide we'd already just discussed. So it's good to have them in a real conversation as well. I wondered maybe we should talk a little bit more about this question about kind of online hate, and it's one of the questions that came up, is how to protect the child. And I guess the part of the question is how would we think about involving a child who's maybe a bit of an older child, probably not something that we would do with a young child, in pre-warning them or prepping them for the possibility that there might be kind of critical people on Facebook, encourage him to think that through before they do an interview. We would do that in sensitive stories with sexual violence survivors, for example. And there's a question, I guess, there. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would really sort of prep them, and if they have a caregiver around, around what it would mean to share certain details. We actually, in one of the workshops we were doing in Romania, there was a journalist that was sharing the story. She worked for a small local media outlet, and she said that a story became known to her of an episode of sexual violence on a teenager, and she tracked down the teenager and her mom, and they were very happy to go to report, to you know, to be open about sort of talking about this story. And she really struggled with it because we're talking about a small place where everybody would have known this person and associated maybe forever her name and face to a story of sexual abuse. And she ended up really pushing back and saying, let's do this story, but I do not want to remember. I don't want to mention the name. I don't want to have pictures. There were just too many elements that would have been recognizable in that context, that even, you know, mentioning a school or mentioning the part of the city or some hobby she had would have made her so recognizable. And this reporter was very much pushing back and did not actually, even if the family and the child were very much in favor of going public with this, she actually stopped it. Now, you may argue, okay, but isn't that actually taking control away from this teenager? We had a very deep conversation. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong, and I would love for us to think about how many grays there are in a lot of the decisions we make. But I think that within the context of a small local media outlet in a small community, this in the long term was probably the best to preserve that person's sort of physical and digital safety long term.
Great. So can I pick up on a question that's in the chat? And by the way, please write some more questions. We have time to pick up. We can go on for another 10-15 minutes. So if you've got other questions, things we've not
Можна
been
задати запитання таке? Я
please
Нікополь,
answer them.
Дніпропетровська область, журналіст Олександр.
Yeah. Yeah, Alexander, please. Yeah. What's the question? I think we're...
Wait, did
No, I
we?
can't
I
see
think he got muted.
Yeah, he's on mute, yeah.
Алло, чуєте мене?
Yes, we can
Алло.
hear you now. Yes. Sorry.
Ну,
what's-
да, зараз бомблять, це я вийшов на вулицю, бо в квартирі нічого не слышно. Я хочу вам задати таке запитання по поводу дітей. Я теж роблю ефіри, прямі ефіри. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи обов'язково питати у батьків, щоб порозмовляти з дитиною, якщо дитина хоче і різного віка ця дитина, можна розмовляти без, так сказати, батьків, без розрішення, дозволу, чи ні? Алло. Ви мене чуєте? Алло.
Should I share my slide on consent again, just to see whether there's something that we can get? Thank you so much for that question. So, you know, I mean, what does it you know, you have a very important question, because actually you might be asking this, I don't know, but if you want to tell me a little bit more, Alexander, why you may be worried about not having the adult around, or what is your worry? Are we talking about older children? Are you worried about the adults or the parents not being around? Or is it more of a generic question, if you don't mind me asking?
Запитання у мене таке, я працюю, усі діти у мене є, і 10, і 8, і підростки, спілкуюсь з ними. А потім батьки пред'являють претензії, а хто вам дав право, і як це ви могли зробити. Хоча усі довольні, раді, що це зробив, що це пішло в ефір. Оце так.
Okay. Well, I mean, ideally, I mean, there are several considerations. One is a legal consideration of, you know, in every country, this is quite different. But in certain countries, there are actual legal consideration. Children below a certain age, you as a media person are not allowed to publish photos or information or you know, conversations with children below a certain age without sort of the adult consent. So there's that. Of course, in circumstances like you know, refugee children or situations of war, sometimes you may not even have easy access to an adult, and it may be very difficult to find the person that actually is in charge of that child to be able to ask for permission. The reason why I believe that it's important to ask adults for permission is especially with children that are a little bit on the younger spectrum, because they may not be considering a series of issues. You know, do they have, maybe, will they talk about an uncle whose story should not be divulged, you know, because of security problems? Are they talking about, you know, their family home in ways that shouldn't be shared because they're not aware of the context, you know? And also, you know, one thing that happened to me is that we were in the Gambia doing actually a story on female football, completely different context. But we had a girl approach us. We were talking to sort of new and upcoming players. We were in a school. So a lot of girls approached us. And at some point, a girl approached us and she just gave us the best interview. She was so motivated. She really loved football. She was, you know, this was going to be her career. She was maybe 8. And then we were like, wow, we got a great character. Let's look for a family before we, you know, we go ahead with this. And we did track down her family. And it turns out that Theresa, I still remember her name, had completely made it all up. She had never touched a ball. She had never thought about football. She was just trying to get a little bit of attention. Now, is it a problem that children lie? I mean, children lie. Sometimes we all lie, but children sometimes lie for different reasons. Sometimes they lie because their memories of an event are not obvious. You know, they don't tell you what we would think about the truth. I mean, Kate can tell you more about sort of how the representation of events can be also changed by trauma. But sometimes having an adult to check a child's story with is not a bad idea because they may be making it up, you know? So I would really stress that consent, especially for younger children, should also be with an adult. May not be a parent, maybe it's an uncle, you know, maybe it's an older sibling or cousin. And that also consent is continuous, you know, it's something that you ask for, that the parent and the child tells you that it's okay to go ahead and that you keep checking in with that person. You know, what if at some point the story gets really dark or difficult and they change their mind? They're like, you know what, actually, I don't feel very good about this story being shared. At that point, it's your cue to stop. And yeah, you've just lost hours of your work and you don't have your story, and that is really bad news, especially if you're, you know, in a challenging environment. But just think about, you know, what comes first. Is it your story or their life?
And I'll just say, can I say one thing on that, Gavin? Just, I think that Irene is saying so wisely the idea that, you know, consent is related to capacity. So think about that. In English, we would say the capacity to understand what you're doing. And a child, and even an adolescent, That brain is growing. Their abstract thinking is not quite what an adult is, right? So I, an adult, might be able to say, if I talk, this is good because people will understand, but you know what? Maybe I'm going to get negative attention, or my family's not going to be happy with this. I can think abstractly about the future, right? I'm an adult. So children's capacity, I guess the answer I would say is think about the capacity of that person in front of you, that small person. Do they really have capacity? Because to me, caregivers, that is their job. I mean, assuming they're a good enough caregiver, their job is to make sure the child's well-being is being protected in terms of consent. So, that example in the chat, by the way, that I think Gavin's going to talk about, the Finland example, I just want to say it's a perfect example of, it's a complex situation. This boy, I think it's a boy, who's 13, his real life is being affected by whatever this story is. This is this 13-year-old's life. So I would not give a recommendation right now, yes or no, to follow that story. But I would say, think about the 13-year-old boy in the middle of it. What is he capable of managing right now emotionally, and of understanding about his situation and what it would mean for him to be identified? So I think for me, the answer is you think beforehand, like a surgeon, where is that knee vulnerable before I start going into the knee?
Great, thanks. Let me offer some quick thoughts on this boy who crossed the border from Finland into Russia. Now, obviously, I don't know the details. So you'll know the details. I don't know the details. So I'm thinking about this as a kind of abstract problem. And I guess one of the questions is, where is the story? So we don't know the situation of this boy. We don't really know what's been going on. There could be all kinds of complicated motivations, complicated factors. It could have been a mistake that he crossed the border. We don't know what the story there is. But one story we do know here is that the Russian state wants to use this as a propaganda example. So maybe the real story is the abuse of the story, if you like. It's a story about how the Russian authorities are taking advantage of a vulnerable child who, for some reason, and we need to preserve the dignity and space of that child, crossed the border. But the child's not the story. It's the abuse of his experience, which for me would be the story. Going back quickly to this question about whether we should interview children without their parents. I mean, in Britain, there are very strict guidelines. Broadcasting and journalism guidelines means that you have to secure parental consent. But there's also another aspect here as well, which is about safeguarding us too. And so say, for example, that we'd be interviewing a child in a very polarized community in which there's a lot of conflict between neighbors or even relatives within a family. I think if I was in that situation, I certainly wouldn't want to be interviewing that child by myself, in case other people, other actors use that encounter for other purposes. And so we have to be a bit careful in terms of our own protection as well. Let me just have a quick look at the questions we've talked. I think we've covered most of them. Does anybody have another question? Yeah.
Є, і ще запитання у мене є, Нікополь. Значить, смотрите, у нас, я ж казав уже, бомблять, все прочее. Вам не кажеться, що треба особу увагу приділити многодітним сім'ям? Там дуже важкі завжди справи, дуже. І переселенці, і ті, що тут живуть, і хто не уїхав, а хто уїхав, ще хуже стало.
Yes, no, that's also very important, isn't it? That sometimes people feel an even greater loss of control when they're not in the place where the actual violence is happening. And we see that particularly with refugees, displaced people who may be looking at a lot of television. So they're seeing a lot of television on a very kind of close angle, and they're seeing only the buildings are destroyed. They never get to see the buildings that are not destroyed, the places that are safe, the people who who are doing well. And so we know from our work with journalists and reporting on refugees that often they're vulnerable partly because they're looking at the news in a particular way as well. But Kate, do you have some thoughts on working with communities when there's a lot of very kinetic violence going on, so shelling, for example?
I mean, what I would just say on that is that is a, you know, there's a condition, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? What is the first word in that? Post. In English, after. That's not what you all are talking about. And I want to say with great respect, it's not what you all are living in. You all, not just the children, obviously, that we're talking about, you all. And so you are living in conditions that are so hard and can be frightening. And so what I want to just invite you to remember is that everything we've talked about today, the body responding to trauma, the mind making meaning, the way people push others away or feel frightened, that can be happening to you all as well. And we acknowledge that and try to remember that you are not telling a story in the past. You're telling a story in the present that involves injustice, violence, harm. And so please, you know, as we're ending, what I would say is, of course, think of the child you approach. Of course, do your preparation. Of course, get good consent. But also, please take care of yourselves in the midst of what you are going through that is so hard on the people of Ukraine.
Yeah, and just to that, I'd like to add something that we've discovered in the workshops that we've done within Ukraine. So the end of November, December, we organized 3 leadership workshops with journalists, trainers, and news editors. And what was really helpful, at least what people who attended, journalists who attended, and told me that was really helpful, was just having an opportunity to discuss and talk about their reactions and their experiences in a way that helped them to notice, you know, how am I feeling in my body? Am I criticizing myself? Do I feel like I should have done more, even in a situation in which I really couldn't have done more? What's going on there? How am I talking to my colleagues? How are my colleagues talking to me? And what am I doing to make sure that I'm staying in touch with the people that really matter to me? So that's the social part of biopsychosocial. How are maybe if we're irritated with each other in the newsroom, it's not because my colleague is really an annoying person. It's because of that story that we worked on this morning that was distressing. Maybe it's affecting our mood. And so sometimes just labeling these reactions and giving them a name doesn't make them disappear magically. It's not about that, but it's about sort of turning the volume down slightly. And that can open up a space in which we're able to kind of focus a bit better, concentrate a bit better, and get on with the tasks that we need to do to support our work.
I'll show you my last tip, Gavin. I have on my
Okay.
computer a little Post-it note, everybody. It's free of charge. You just get a Post-it note, and there's a red arrow and going up and a gray arrow. And when I'm working, thinking, whatever, on a Zoom, if I start to feel agitated, edgy, nervous, I put my finger on the red arrow and I just say, Kate, you feel a little bit of red arrow right now. If I'm tired, down, fatigued, I put my finger on the gray arrow and I say, I'm a little bit down right now. It's a little way to say to your body, I hear you, I am noticing you. This is free, everybody. You just need one Post-it note.
Irina.
I was going to say just one final thing, which is, you remember the image I shared of, myself sort of drawn by my son. I'm also a mother, and I didn't realize how much becoming a mother affected me in reporting about children. But there was a moment where my personal experience of the world around me became very much affected by my personal experience as a human being a mother. It could have been by being an aunt or an older sister, So what I'm saying is think about what your circumstances are, and maybe that interview for you is particularly hard because it resonates with you at a level that you can't quite think of, because maybe you've interviewed children your whole life, but then at now something about that child or the story they're telling, or being around a younger child creates a very strong reaction. And so maybe also ask yourself, why am I having this reaction now? And maybe there's something about who you are in that moment that will be affecting you more than maybe at another time, and notice it. And that noticing has definitely helped me in my work, to be a bit more, to give more space to the feelings that were coming up.
Great, thank you. So I think that brings us to the end, unless there's anybody wanted to rush in very, very quickly and ask a short question. I think probably we should end it here, because people, you've got busy days, I know, and other work to do. I'd just like to, first of all, thank Kate and Irina for sharing their expertise. It's been always wonderful to work with them. But also I'd like to express our deep gratitude to you for doing the work that you're doing. And it's incredibly important, and it's not just important for Ukraine, it's important for every society that believes in freedom and democracy, and also believes in basic human dignity and decency. The idea that we only thrive as societies if we respect everybody in those societies, and also the future generations as well coming up. So, Sergey, I don't know if you turned on your camera to say something, but it's always lovely to see your face. So glad to see you. Picture.
Ну, я тільки кілька слів, якби подяка за таку круту експертизу вас і ваших колег. І для нас дійсно дуже цінно чути ці і поради, і загалом бачити, що ви розумієте і хочете допомогти. І загалом дійсно, на жаль, зараз перед українськими журналістами так багато викликів одномоментно з точки зору травмуючих ось цих всіх факторів, що знову ж ми дуже цінуємо якраз наші зустрічі і можливість і почути професіоналів. Ми розуміємо, що ви співчуваєте нам і нашим колегам, але звичайно, що усвідомлення нами зовнішньої підтримки одне, але важливо ще якось всередині знаходити баланс, щоб загалом зберігати спокій і не вигорати через оці всі виклики, бо одна справа усвідомлення, а друге реальні відчуття, які є. Але я дуже вдячний за цю дружбу і партнерство.
Great, thank you so much. And that's a good point to remind everybody that the third session, which is next Wednesday, we're going to be talking more about managing burnout and leadership, and particularly what editors and news managers can do to support their organizations at this very, very challenging time. So we say goodbye, and it's lovely to have the opportunity to talk to you all. Great. Good.
Bye.
Bye. Дякую вас. До побачення.